ballroom had been booked for months, decorated, catered, ready. Marcus Hale's name was written across a banner above the entrance, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the CEO whose decisions once moved markets. Tonight was his 55th birthday, and tonight, not one person showed up. His executives had called with excuses. His oldest friends had gone silent. The people he had given everything to, promotions, opportunities, decades of loyalty, couldn't find 2 hours for him. Marcus slowly wheeled himself to the head of the empty table. He looked out at 40 untouched chairs, 40 unlit candles, 40 people who chose not to come. 2 years ago, a single accident had taken his ability to walk, and somewhere along the way, without him even noticing, it had taken his people too. The event manager quietly leaned toward her staff. "Start packing it down." That's when the door opened. No one recognized him. A single father, worn jacket, a sleepy little girl pressed against his shoulder. He had no invitation. He didn't know Marcus personally, but earlier that day he had overheard something small, almost nothing, and he simply could not walk away. What happened inside that ballroom over the next hour changed both their lives forever. If this story touches your heart, take a second right now, leave a comment below, hit subscribe, and let's get into it together. Marcus Hale had not always been a man who sat still. There was a time, not so long ago, when he was the first person through the office doors every single morning and the last one to leave at night. He had built Hale and Crown Industries from a rented room with second-hand furniture and one laptop that overheated every afternoon. No investors, no safety net, nothing but an obsessive belief that if he outworked everyone in the room, eventually the room would have to notice. And it did. By the time Marcus was 52, his company employed over 3,000 people across 6 cities. His name appeared in business magazines. His phone never stopped ringing. He was, by every measurable standard, a man who had made it. But success has a way of making you believe that the people around you are there because of who you are, not because of what you can give them. And Marcus, for all his intelligence, had never quite learned the difference. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in November. Marcus had been driving back from a late dinner with one of his board members, the kind of dinner that runs 3 hours longer than planned and leaves you tired in a way that coffee cannot fix. The roads were wet. The other driver ran a red light. The collision lasted less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds rearranged everything. Marcus woke up in a hospital room 2 days later, with his assistant sitting in the corner and a doctor standing at the foot of his bed with the kind of careful, rehearsed expression that tells you the news before a single word is spoken. The damage to his lower spine was severe and permanent. He would not walk again. Marcus had faced boardroom battles, hostile takeovers, financial collapses, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the silence of that hospital room and the weight of those 4 words. He lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time after the doctor left. And the very first thought that crossed his mind was not about his company, not about money, not about what he would lose. It was about who would come. He had spent 30 years building a life surrounded by people. Surely, he thought, this was the moment they would show up. What actually happened in those weeks that followed was something Marcus never spoke about publicly. But it was the thing that broke him far more than the accident itself. Some came at first, of course. Flowers arrived, messages poured in. His phone buzzed constantly for the first 10 days. But somewhere around the 3rd week, the calls began thinning. The visits stopped. His executives ran the company smoothly without him, perhaps too smoothly. His board members, men and women he had personally hired, personally trusted, began holding meetings he wasn't invited to. Not out of malice, they would have said, out of practicality. Marcus was recovering. Marcus needed rest. But Marcus, lying in his rehabilitation facility with hours of silence stretching around him every day, understood what was really happening. He had confused proximity with loyalty his entire life. The people who had filled his calendar and laughed at his jokes and clinked glasses with him at every company celebration, they had been there for the version of Marcus that could do something for them. The version sitting in a wheelchair with an uncertain future was a different proposition entirely. He told himself it didn't hurt. He was a practical man. He understood human nature. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that finds you when you realize the life you built was full of people, and still somehow completely empty. And that loneliness had moved into Marcus Hale like a permanent tenant. He returned to work 8 months after the accident. Different entrance now. the one with the ramp. Different rhythm, slower, more deliberate, aware of every doorway and every step that no longer belonged to him. His staff were professional and kind in that careful, overly gentle way that people are when they don't know what to say. Nobody treated him the way they used to. The easy jokes were gone. The spontaneous conversations in the hallway disappeared. People would see him coming and suddenly find something urgent to look at on their phones. Marcus noticed all of it. He said nothing. He simply worked, the way he had always worked, relentlessly, quietly, without complaint. But something had shifted inside him that he couldn't quite name yet. He had started to wonder, in the long evenings after everyone else had gone home, whether any of it had ever been real. The friendships, the loyalty, the sense that he mattered to people beyond his title and his bank account. He wondered, and this was the thought that kept him awake some nights, whether anyone would notice if he simply disappeared. His 55th birthday fell on a Friday in March. His assistant, Elena, a warm and quietly determined woman who had worked for Marcus for 11 years and was one of the very few people whose loyalty had never flickered, had organized the evening herself. A ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, 40 guests, dinner, music, a proper celebration. She had sent the invitations 6 weeks in advance. She had followed up personally. Every single person had confirmed. Marcus had not asked for any of it, had actually told Elena it wasn't necessary, but she had insisted with that particular gentle firmness she used when she knew she was right. So Marcus had agreed, and somewhere, underneath the practical exterior he showed the world, he had allowed himself to feel something that had become unfamiliar to him over the past 2 years. He had allowed himself to hope. He had no idea yet that hope, on this particular evening, was about to cost him more than he had bargained for. By 7:15, Elena was standing near the entrance of the ballroom checking her phone for the 14th time. One guest had arrived, Marcus's accountant, a quiet older man named Gerald, who came because Gerald came to everything and never made excuses. Everyone else had sent messages in the last hour: prior commitment, family emergency, flight delayed, sudden illness. One board member, a man Marcus had personally mentored for 9 years, hadn't even bothered to respond at all. Elena walked slowly back across the empty ballroom toward Marcus, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. Marcus was sitting at the head of the table, perfectly still, looking out at 40 empty chairs with an expression that Elena would later describe as the most heartbreaking thing she had ever seen in her life. Not because he looked devastated, but because he didn't look surprised. He had expected this. He had hoped anyway, and hoping had been the mistake. Elena sat down beside him and placed her hand over his and said she was so sorry. Marcus looked at her and smiled, a real smile, small and tired and entirely genuine, and said, "Don't be. This is useful information." What he meant by that, Elena didn't understand yet. But she would. Because what Marcus Hale decided in that moment, quietly, calmly, without anger, was something nobody in that company could have predicted. And then the door opened. His name was Daniel Reeves, 38 years old, construction supervisor by trade, though work had been inconsistent lately, and inconsistent was a polite word for what the last 14 months had actually felt like. He had a daughter named Lily, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, the kind of child who collected stray cats and asked questions about everything, and made you believe, on the days when belief was difficult, that the world still had something good left in it. Daniel had been raising her alone for 4 years, ever since his wife Claire had lost her battle with cancer in the spring when Lily was only 3. He didn't talk about that much, not because it didn't still hurt. It did, every single day, in small, quiet ways that grief has of reminding you it hasn't finished, but because there was always something more immediate that needed his attention. A school pickup, a broken pipe in the apartment, a bill that had arrived 2 weeks too early. Daniel had learned, out of pure necessity, to keep moving. Grief was something he carried, not something he stopped for. He hadn't planned to be anywhere near the Meridian Hotel that evening. He had been finishing a small repair job in the building next door. A contractor had called him last minute, the kind of cash-in-hand work Daniel never turned down. And Lily had been with him because the after-school program had closed early, and there was no one else. She had sat in the corner of the worksite all afternoon on an upturned bucket, doing her homework with a concentration that made the other workers smile at her without realizing they were doing it. By 6:30 the job was done, and Daniel was packing up his tools, tired in the way that only physical work on an empty stomach produces, when Lily tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward the hotel entrance across the street. There was a banner above the door, gold lettering, a name, and beneath the awning, a woman in a black dress was standing alone, pressing her fingers to her temples, speaking quietly into her phone, with the rigid stillness of someone trying very hard not to cry in public. Daniel didn't mean to overhear. He was simply close enough, and the street was simply quiet enough, and some words carry further than people intend them to. He heard the woman say, her voice tight and controlled, and breaking only slightly at the edges, "Elena, there's no one here. I've called everyone. No one is coming. He's sitting in there alone, and it's his birthday, and I don't know what to do." Daniel stopped packing. He stood very still for a moment. Lily looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes she had inherited from her mother, the ones that always seemed to understand a situation before Daniel had finished processing it, and she said, very simply, "Daddy, we should go in." And this small moment on a pavement outside a hotel neither of them had any business entering, was the moment that changed everything. Though Daniel didn't know that yet, he was just a tired man listening to his 7-year-old daughter, the way good fathers do. He almost didn't. That's the part that matters. He stood there for a full minute, turning it over in his mind, the way practical people do when something feels right but makes no logical sense. He didn't know this man. He had no invitation. His jacket had a frayed cuff and his boots had dried concrete on them, and he was carrying a child's backpack decorated with cartoon cats. Walking into a ballroom at the Meridian Hotel was not something Daniel Reeves had any business doing on a Friday evening. But then Lily slipped her hand into his, and Daniel had learned, in 4 years of raising her alone, that his daughter's instincts about people and moments were almost never wrong. He took a breath. He straightened his jacket as best he could, and he walked through the door. The ballroom stopped him, not because it was grand, though it was, but because of what it felt like. 40 tables dressed in white linen, candles burning low over untouched centerpieces, a 3-tier cake on a side table that nobody had cut, and at the far end of the room, at the head of the longest table, a man in a wheelchair sitting completely alone with a glass of water in front of him, and the particular stillness of someone who has decided to stop waiting. Elena was beside him, her hand on his arm, speaking softly. The few members of staff who remained were moving quietly near the edges of the room, packing things down with the practiced efficiency of people who have learned not to draw attention to a sad situation. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment and took all of it in. 40 chairs, one person, a birthday banner that suddenly felt cruel rather than celebratory. He had seen loneliness before. He had lived inside it. But there was something about this particular scene, this room that had been prepared with such care for people who chose not to come, that landed somewhere deep in his chest and didn't move. He walked across the room. Elena saw him first and moved to intercept him, gently, professionally, already forming the polite words for asking someone to leave. And Daniel held up a hand and said quietly, "I'm not here to cause any trouble. He paused and glanced toward Marcus and said the only true thing he could think of. Nobody should sit alone on their birthday. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Lily, who was staring at Marcus with that open, unguarded expression that children have before the world teaches them to be careful. And Elena stepped aside. What happened next was something she would tell people about for years afterward, always with the same slight shake of her head, as though she still couldn't entirely believe it. Daniel walked to the table and pulled out the chair directly to Marcus's left, not across from him, not at a polite distance, but right beside him, and sat down. Lily climbed into the next chair and folded her hands on the table with the focused seriousness of a child attending a very important meeting. Marcus looked at them both. His expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted in his eyes, a slight loosening, almost imperceptible, the way a person looks when they have been bracing for a long time, and something small and unexpected makes them forget, just for a second, to keep bracing. Daniel extended his hand and said, "I'm Daniel. This is Lily. We were next door and he smiled, a little self-consciously. "We heard it was someone's birthday." Marcus looked at the hand, then he shook it, and he said very quietly, "Marcus." And Lily said with complete sincerity, "Happy birthday, Marcus. We didn't bring a present, but Daddy can fix almost anything if something is broken." There was a pause, and then Marcus Hale, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, laughed. A real laugh, small and rusty and genuine and completely unguarded. The sound of it seemed to surprise even him. But what Daniel would discover about Marcus over the next 2 hours, the truth beneath the empire, beneath the wheelchair, beneath the birthday that no one came to, was something he had not walked in prepared for. And it would change the way Daniel saw his own life in ways he wouldn't fully understand until much later. If this story is reminding you not to judge someone by what you see on the surface, drop the words, "never judge," in the comments right now. Because Marcus had been judged, and Daniel had been judged, and both of them them, in very different ways, were carrying more than anyone around them ever bothered to notice. The cake had been sitting untouched on the side table for nearly an hour, when Elena quietly asked the remaining staff to light the candles. Not because there was a crowd to sing, not because the evening had gone anything like planned, but because Marcus Hale was 55 years old tonight, and there was a little girl at the table who had just informed everyone within earshot that a birthday without candles didn't count. Lily had said it with the kind of absolute authority that only 7-year-olds possess, the sort of confidence that hasn't yet been worn down by the world's habit of telling people their opinions don't matter. Marcus had looked at her when she said it, really looked at her, the way adults look at children when they say something that cuts straight through all the careful layers a grown person spends years constructing, and something in his face had softened in a way that Elena hadn't seen in 2 years. The candles were lit. The three of them sat together in that enormous empty room, and Lily sang Happy Birthday at full volume, with complete unself-consciousness, and Marcus listened to every word with his hands folded on the table and his eyes very bright, and Daniel sat beside him and thought that he had never seen a person look simultaneously so dignified and so quietly devastated and so unexpectedly grateful all at once. It was Lily who broke the ice, the way Lily always broke ice, not carefully, not strategically, but simply by being incapable of sitting near another human being without wanting to understand them. She asked Marcus why he used a wheelchair. Children ask the questions adults spend enormous energy avoiding, and Marcus, to his credit, didn't flinch. He told her there had been an accident, that his legs didn't work the way they used to. Lily considered this with great seriousness, and then asked whether it hurt. Marcus said, not anymore, not physically. Lily nodded slowly, as though she understood that pain had more than one address, and then she said, my mummy isn't here either. She went to heaven when I was little. Daddy says she can still see us though. The table went very quiet. Daniel looked at his daughter with that particular helpless love that parents carry, the kind that fills your chest until it almost aches. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, I think that's probably true. And Lily smiled and reached over and patted his hand once, the way a much older person might, and went back to her cake. Daniel watched Marcus in the seconds after that small gesture and saw something cross the man's face that he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't until much later that he would understand what it was. It was the look of a person remembering, for the first time in a very long time, that kindness still existed in the world and was not always attached to an agenda. They talked for a long time after that, longer than Daniel had expected when he walked through those doors. Marcus asked about Lily's school, about Daniel's work, about the construction project next door. He asked questions the way people do when they are genuinely curious, rather than merely polite. Follow-up questions, specific questions, the kind that tell you the other person is actually listening. Daniel found himself talking more openly than he usually did with strangers, more openly than he did with most people he had known for years. There was something about Marcus that made honesty feel safe. Maybe it was the wheelchair, maybe it was the empty room, maybe it was simply that both of them had arrived at this evening, carrying the particular freedom that comes from having nothing left to perform. Daniel mentioned Claire, his wife, without planning to, the way you mention something when your guard has been down long enough that the truth just surfaces naturally. He said it simply, without drama, just a sentence or two, and Marcus didn't offer condolences in that stiff, rehearsed way people usually did. He simply said, how long? And when Daniel told him, Marcus nodded and said, the 4th year is the strangest one. You start to feel guilty for the moments when you forget. Daniel stared at him, because that was exactly it. That was precisely the thing he had never been able to explain to anyone, the thing he had barely even admitted to himself. He opened his mouth to respond and found, to his considerable embarrassment, that he had no words, only that tight pressure behind the eyes that a man carries all day and spends enormous energy not acknowledging. What Daniel did not yet know was that Marcus understood grief from the inside, in a way he hadn't shared with anyone, not his board, not his executives, not even Elena, and the reason for that was something that would surface before the evening ended and reframe everything Daniel thought he understood about the man sitting beside him. The evening stretched past 9 o'clock. Elena brought coffee, and then more coffee, and at some point produced a plate of small desserts from somewhere and set them in front of Lily, who accepted them with the gracious seriousness of someone accustomed to being provided for at formal occasions. The staff had long since finished packing down the unused tables, moving quietly around the edges of the room, until eventually it was just the three of them, at one small circle of candlelight, in the middle of all that empty marble. Marcus had relaxed in a way that Daniel suspected he rarely allowed himself in public. The careful professional posture had given way to something more natural. He leaned slightly in his chair. He laughed more than once, that same rusty, unguarded laugh from earlier, which Daniel was was beginning to understand was probably the real one, the one that existed before all the years of boardrooms and performance and expectation had built a more composed version on top of it. At one point, Marcus looked around the room, at the empty tables, the extinguished candles, the banner with his name on it, and said, with the flat honesty of a man who had stopped softening things for himself, "I spent 30 years building something, and tonight taught me I may have built it entirely alone." He didn't say it with self-pity. He said it the way a person states a fact they've recently finished arguing with. Daniel didn't try to contradict him or comfort him with empty reassurance. He just said, "Maybe. Or maybe you just found out who isn't worth keeping." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You're very direct for someone who broke into my birthday party." And Daniel said, "You're very calm for someone whose entire guest list canceled in the same hour." And Marcus smiled. And for a little while, the empty room didn't feel quite so empty. It was nearly 10 when Lily fell asleep in her chair, listing slowly sideways until her head came to rest against Daniel's arm, with the total boneless trust of an exhausted child. Daniel shifted carefully so she wouldn't fall, and Marcus watched the movement with an expression that Daniel didn't catch, because he was looking at Lily. Elena caught it though. She saw it clearly from where she stood near the doorway, and she would think about it afterward. That expression on Marcus's face as he watched a tired single father adjust his sleeping daughter's weight without a second thought. And she would understand that something had happened tonight that she didn't yet have language for. Marcus cleared his throat quietly and said, "She's a remarkable child." Daniel looked up and said, "She's the only thing I've ever done completely right." The room was very still after that. Just candles burning low and the distant sound of the city outside, and a sleeping 7-year-old between two men who had arrived at this evening from entirely different directions and somehow ended up in exactly the same place. And then Marcus said something, quietly, almost to himself, in the tone of a person deciding something they hadn't planned to decide tonight. What he said made Daniel go very still, and what he asked, what Marcus Hale, a man who needed nothing and could buy anything, asked a stranger who had walked in off the street with concrete on his boots and someone else's backpack, was the last thing Daniel could have possibly expected. Marcus was quiet for a moment after he said it, as though he wanted to give the words a chance to land before either of them reacted to them. Daniel sat very still, one hand resting on Lily's sleeping shoulder, and looked at the man across from him with the careful expression of someone trying to decide whether they had heard correctly. What Marcus had asked was not complicated. It wasn't a business proposition, or a grand gesture, or anything that required a lawyer or a contract or a formal discussion. It was simpler than that, and somehow that made it more disarming. He had asked whether Daniel and Lily would have dinner with him next Friday. That was all. Just dinner. A real one, he had said, with actual guests, meaning himself and the two of them, somewhere quiet, without a banner and without a guest list that evaporated overnight. Daniel had expected many things from this evening. That particular question was not among them. He looked at Marcus for a long moment and then said, "Why us?" And Marcus said, without hesitation, and without any of the careful diplomatic language he used in boardrooms, "Because you came in, and you didn't have a single reason to." Daniel had no answer for that, because Marcus was right, and sometimes the truest things are the ones that leave you with nothing to say. He said yes. Of course he said yes, though not immediately, and not because he was uncertain, but because Daniel was the kind of man who didn't agree to things without meaning them, and he wanted to be sure he meant it before he spoke. He did mean it. There was something about Marcus Hale that had gotten under his skin over the course of the evening, in a way he hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely explain. Not the money, not the company or the name above the door, or any of the things that made Marcus significant to the rest of the world. It was something quieter than that. It was the way Marcus had listened, the way he had spoken to Lily as though her observations were worth taking seriously, which they were, but most adults needed to be around her for considerably longer before they understood that. It was the thing Marcus had said about the 4th year of grief, said it with the certainty of someone who wasn't guessing, and that was the thread Daniel had been quietly pulling at all evening, the thing he kept returning to, the detail that didn't quite fit the picture he had been given of this man. Marcus Hale was a CEO, a builder of companies, a person whose life, from the outside, appeared to have been constructed entirely from ambition and forward motion. So where, Daniel kept wondering, had that specific understanding of grief come from? He hadn't asked, but he hadn't forgotten either, and what he would learn the following Friday would answer that question in a way that made the entire evening reframe itself in his memory. The following week passed the way weeks do when something is coming that you are quietly looking forward to, but haven't admitted to yourself yet. Daniel worked. He picked Lily up from school. He fixed a neighbor's leaking tap on Wednesday evening because saying no to people who needed help was something he had never been able to manage. Lily talked about Marcus 3 times without prompting. Once at breakfast, once on the way to school, and once completely out of nowhere on Thursday night while Daniel was washing dishes, when she announced that she thought Marcus was probably lonely, in the same way that their neighbor Mr. Farouk was lonely since his wife passed, and that lonely people needed feeding regularly like plants needed water. Daniel had stood at the sink for a moment with a wet plate in his hand, and thought that his 7-year-old daughter understood human nature more clearly than most people he had met in his adult life. He also thought, and this was the thought that surprised him slightly, that he was looking forward to Friday more than he had looked forward to anything in a long time. He wasn't entirely sure what that meant yet, but he noticed it. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was small and quiet and entirely without pretension, which was not what Daniel had expected and was precisely the right choice. No grand gesture, no private room with a chandelier, just a corner table, good lighting, simple food, and enough privacy that a conversation could breathe. Marcus was already there when Daniel arrived with Lily, already seated, and he looked different outside the ballroom, less formal. There was a book on the table beside his water glass, which told Daniel something about how Marcus spent his evenings, and a slight ease in his posture that hadn't been fully present the week before, as though the decision to invite them had settled something in him. Lily greeted him like an old friend, which at this point, in her own accounting, he was. She sat down and immediately told him about something that had happened at school that week, involving a misunderstanding over a shared pencil case, relayed with the narrative detail and moral seriousness of a seasoned storyteller. Marcus listened to every word, and it was during that story, watching Marcus lean slightly forward in his chair, with complete attention fixed on a 7-year-old's account of a pencil case dispute, that Daniel understood something he hadn't been able to articulate before. Marcus Hale was not lonely because he was cold or difficult or incapable of connection. He was lonely because the world had decided what he was before getting anywhere near who he was. And that specific kind of loneliness was something Daniel understood from the inside out. It was over the main course that Marcus finally told him. Not prompted, not asked, just offered. The way people offer the important things when they have decided to trust someone, and the timing simply arrives. He had been married once. Her name was Nadia. They had met when Marcus was 26 and still building the company from that overheated laptop in the rented room, and she had believed in what he was doing before there was any rational reason to. They had been together for 19 years. She had died 14 months before the accident. Ovarian cancer. Fast and brutal and completely without warning. And Marcus had done what Marcus did with everything that was painful. He had worked. He had pushed forward. He had filled every hour so completely that grief had no room to settle. And then the accident had taken his legs and his ability to fill the hours, and suddenly, there was nothing between him and the loss he had never actually processed. He said all of this quietly and without theater, in the same even tone he had used when discussing quarterly projections, which somehow made it more devastating than if he had wept. Daniel sat across from him and thought about Claire. He thought about the plant on the windowsill at home that Lily watered every morning because Claire had planted it. He thought about the 4th year being the strangest one, and he understood, finally and completely, why Marcus had said that with such certainty. They closed the restaurant. The staff were too polite to hurry them, and Marcus tipped generously enough that politeness was probably not the only factor. Lily had fallen asleep again. She had a talent for it, for finding sleep in chairs the way other people found it in beds, and Daniel carried her to the car while Marcus waited near the entrance. And when Daniel came back to say goodnight, Marcus extended his hand, and Daniel shook it, and Marcus said, "Same time next week?" And Daniel said yes, without hesitating this time, because some things you don't need to think about twice. Over the months that followed, the Friday dinners became a quiet fixture. Lily began drawing pictures for Marcus and insisting Daniel deliver them. Marcus began appearing at Lily's school events, discreetly, never drawing attention, simply because she had mentioned them, and he had listened. What grew between the 3 of them was not dramatic or sudden, or the kind of thing that makes noise. It was simply real. And real things, built slowly between people who have both known loss and chosen kindness anyway, tend to last in a way that almost nothing else does. Marcus never filled that ballroom again with people who didn't deserve to be there, but he stopped eating alone. And Daniel, who had spent 4 years moving so fast that he never let himself feel how tired he was, finally had somewhere to slow down. Lily had been right, the way Lily was almost always right. Lonely people needed feeding regularly, and sometimes, if you walk through the right door on the right evening, for no reason other than it feels like the human thing to do, you find that you were hungry too. If this story reminded you that one small act of kindness can walk through a door and change everything, please subscribe to Beyond Kindness. this right now. There are people in this world sitting in empty rooms tonight, not because nobody cares, but because nobody walked in. Be the person who walks in. Hit that subscribe button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we will see you in the next story.